You might want to remember this moment, she said quietly, her voice steady in a room that had already decided who she was. Because not everything is what it looks like. The words didn't echo loudly, but they lingered in the air like something unfinished, something waiting to be understood, yet no one moved, no one responded. Because in that courtroom on a gray Tuesday morning, people had already made up their minds long before she ever spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, almost sterile glow across polished wooden benches and neatly stacked case files. The kind of light that flattened everything, faces, emotions, truth, into something easier to ignore. And at the center of it all stood Amara Bennett, wrists held together in cold metal cuffs, her posture straight despite the weight of assumption pressing down on her shoulders, her expression calm in a way that unsettled those who bothered to look closely, though most didn't, because to them she was just another name on the docket, another case to process, another interruption in a long, predictable day. Officer Daniel Hayes stood just a few feet away, his uniform crisp, his presence firm, the kind of authority that came not just from a badge but from years of being listened to without question, and his eyes never quite settled on her as a person, only as a problem to be handled, his pen scratching across a report with casual certainty, each word reinforcing a version of events no one in the room seemed eager to challenge. Somewhere in the back, a clerk shuffled papers, hesitating for just a second longer than necessary before glancing up, as if something about the silence didn't feel right. But hesitation in a place like this was a luxury few could afford, and so the moment passed without comment. Amara adjusted her stance slightly, the faint sound of the cuffs shifting against her skin barely audible, yet in that stillness it felt louder than it should have, a reminder of how easily control could be taken, labeled, justified, and accepted, and still she said nothing, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something more deliberate, like she was measuring the weight of every second, letting the room reveal itself before she chose to respond. Officer Hayes exhaled slowly, glancing toward the empty judge's bench with a flicker of impatience, his jaw tightening as he checked the time, because delays irritated him, and unpredictability even more so. And right now, this moment felt like both, though he couldn't quite explain why. "You'll get your turn," he muttered under his breath, not expecting a reply, not expecting anything at all, because in his world, people like her didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't interrupt, didn't shift the rhythm of a system that had already decided its pace. But Amara's gaze lifted then, not sharply, not confrontationally, just enough to meet his line of sight for a brief second, and there was something in her eyes, not defiance, not anger, but clarity, the kind that didn't ask for permission to exist, and it lingered just long enough to create a small, almost imperceptible crack in the certainty he carried so easily. Across the room, a young attorney paused mid-sentence, his attention drawn by something he couldn't quite name, while the clerk's fingers hovered above a document, the silence stretching thinner now, more fragile, as if one wrong movement might break it completely. Amara inhaled slowly, steady and controlled, the kind of breath that suggested not surrender, but preparation, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably certain. "You might want to double-check that report," she said, not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to be heard. And for a moment, no one reacted, because the idea that she could be right hadn't yet crossed their minds. Officer Hayes let out a short, dismissive breath, the corner of his mouth tightening into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That won't be necessary," he replied, his tone final, practiced, the kind that ended conversations before they began. And yet the room didn't quite settle the way it should have, the air holding on to her words like they mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Amara didn't argue, didn't push, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, composed, her presence quietly refusing to shrink, and in that refusal, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the first sign of a storm no one had predicted. And somewhere deep in the rhythm of that courtroom, beneath the paperwork and procedure and polished routines, the truth waited, patient and unbothered, knowing it didn't need to shout to be heard. The silence did not settle the way it was supposed to. It stretched instead, thin and uneasy, like something just beneath the surface had shifted out of place, and even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, pressing into the stillness as if demanding attention that no one was willing to give. Officer Daniel Hayes tapped his pen once against the clipboard, a small, controlled motion, but it carried the weight of irritation. Because order mattered to him, structure mattered, and this moment, this quiet resistance from a woman who should have been compliant, felt like a disruption he could not easily categorize. "I said it is not necessary," he repeated, this time more clearly, his voice firm enough to reassert control, or at least that was the intention. But intention and outcome did not always align, and the room, for reasons no one openly acknowledged, did not fall back into line as quickly as it should have. Amara Bennett lowered her gaze for just a second, not in submission, but in consideration, as if she was choosing her next move with care, the way someone does when they understand that timing matters more than volume. And when she looked back up, her expression had not changed, still calm, still composed. But there was something else there now, something sharper, something that did not ask to be believed, only to be noticed. Across the aisle, the young attorney shifted in his seat, his fingers brushing the edge of a file he had not planned to open. Again, yet something compelled him, a quiet instinct that did not come from authority but from observation, and he flipped it open just enough to scan the first page, his eyes narrowing slightly as if the words did not align the way he expected. The clerk, who had hesitated before, now leaned forward almost imperceptibly, her attention no longer divided, her pen hovering above the margin of a document as she replayed the last few minutes in her mind, searching for the moment that had felt off, the detail she might have missed. Officer Hayes noticed the shift, subtle as it was, and his jaw tightened, not because anything had been said outright, but because doubt, once introduced, had a way of spreading quietly, without permission, and he did not like that. Not here, not in a room where his word was supposed to be enough. "You are not in a position to question anything," he said, directing the statement toward Amara, though his eyes flickered briefly toward the others, as if reminding them as well, reinforcing the hierarchy that kept everything in place. But the words did not land with the same finality as before, not entirely, not completely. Amara tilted her head slightly, a small, almost thoughtful gesture, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same steady tone, unhurried, unshaken. "I am not questioning," she said, pausing just long enough for the distinction to settle. "I am asking you to be certain." And that difference, subtle as it was, changed something, because certainty required verification, and verification required attention, and attention was already beginning to shift. The attorney's eyes moved more quickly now, scanning lines, cross-referencing details, his brow furrowing as a discrepancy surfaced, small at first, then more defined, like a thread that, once pulled, began to unravel something larger. The clerk exhaled softly, almost inaudibly, as she reached for another document, aligning it beside the first, her movements careful, deliberate, as if she did not want to draw attention to what she was doing, yet the act itself spoke volumes. Officer Hayes straightened slightly, his posture tightening, because he could feel it now, the room slipping, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that control no longer felt absolute. And for the first time since he had stepped into that courtroom, he glanced toward the empty judge's bench, not with impatience, but with something closer to anticipation or perhaps unease. Amara followed that glance for just a fraction of a second, then returned her focus forward, her hands still, the faint imprint of the cuffs visible against her skin, but her presence no longer confined by them, not in the way that mattered, and she said nothing more, because she did not need to, because the moment had already begun to move on its own, building quietly, steadily, towards something no one in that room was fully prepared to face. The tension did not break, it deepened, settling into the corners of the courtroom like a quiet pressure that no one could quite release, and the more it lingered, the more it demanded to be acknowledged, not through words, but through the small, involuntary shifts in posture and attention that revealed what people were beginning to feel. The young attorney turned another page, slower this time, his fingers pressing lightly against the paper as if grounding himself in something tangible, and his eyes paused on a line that should have matched, should have aligned perfectly with the report Officer Hayes had just finalized, yet it did not not exactly, not cleanly, and that slight misalignment, barely noticeable to anyone not looking for it, began to expand in his mind. He leaned forward, just enough for the clerk to notice, and without a word, he angled the document slightly in her direction, a silent invitation to confirm what he was starting to suspect. She hesitated for half a second, then leaned in, her breath catching softly as her eyes traced the same line, the same detail, and her pen, still hovering, finally touched the margin with a small, precise mark, not dramatic, not obvious, but deliberate. Across the room, Officer Hayes felt it before he fully saw it, that subtle exchange, that quiet collaboration, and something in his chest tightened, not fear, not yet, but awareness. The kind that comes when control begins to slip in ways that cannot be immediately corrected. If there is something to say, say it, he called out, his voice steady but edged now, directed not just at Amara, but at the room itself, as if calling the uncertainty into the open would make it easier to manage. The attorney looked up, his expression careful, measured, as if weighing the cost of speaking against the weight of what he had found, and for a moment, he said nothing, because in a place like this, timing could change everything. Amara remained still, her gaze forward, her presence unchanged, yet there was a quiet shift in her posture, a subtle straightening that suggested she already knew where this was going, not because she was guessing, but because she had seen it before, the moment when doubt begins to replace assumption. When people start to look twice at what they once accepted without question, the clerk cleared her throat softly, the sound barely carrying. Yet in the stillness it drew attention, and she adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, aligning them with careful precision before finally speaking, her voice controlled but unmistakably firm. "There is a discrepancy in the timeline," she said, not accusing, not confrontational, simply stating what was there, and that alone was enough to shift the room further. Officer Hayes blinked once, his grip tightening slightly on the clipboard, and he took a step forward. Closing the small distance between himself and the clerk, his presence intended to reassert authority, to contain the situation before it expanded. "There is no discrepancy," he replied, his tone deliberate, each word placed with intention, but the certainty did not carry the same weight it had moments ago, not entirely. The attorney exhaled slowly, then spoke, his voice calm but clear. "The report states the incident occurred at 9:15, he said, tapping the page lightly. "But this document logs her entry into the building at 9:23. And the difference, small in numbers, felt larger in implication, like a crack spreading through glass. A murmur, barely audible, moved through the back rows, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal that the room was no longer aligned in its assumptions. Officer Hayes glanced down at the report, just for a second, and in that second, something flickered across his expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but not unnoticed, not by those who were now paying closer attention. Amara watched quietly, her eyes steady, her breathing even, and when she finally spoke again, it was not to challenge, not to accuse, but to anchor the moment in something undeniable. "Certainty requires accuracy," she said softly, the words landing with a quiet weight that did not need volume to be felt. And no one interrupted, no one dismissed it, because the room had already begun to change, and once that shift started, it could not easily be reversed. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened, the faint sound of footsteps approaching, measured and deliberate, and though no one had yet turned to look, the presence was felt, like the next piece of the moment had arrived, ready or not. And for the first time since the morning began, the empty bench at the front of the courtroom no longer felt like a delay, but like something about to matter in a way no one had expected. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew clearer, measured and unhurried, echoing softly against the marble floors outside the courtroom doors, and without anyone needing to say it. The shift in the room became undeniable, because presence has a way of announcing itself long before it is seen. The bailiff, who had been standing near the side wall, straightened instinctively, his posture tightening as his gaze moved toward the entrance. And that single movement was enough to ripple through the room, subtle but unmistakable, as conversations that had barely begun fell silent again, and eyes that had been focused on documents and discrepancies now turned toward the front. Officer Daniel Hayes followed that motion, his expression tightening just slightly, the earlier confidence in his stance now tempered by something less certain, something that had crept in quietly over the past few minutes and refused to leave. Amara Bennett did not turn immediately. She did not react with urgency or curiosity. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, as if the approaching moment was not unexpected but inevitable. Like a page in a story she had already read, the courtroom doors opened with a controlled, deliberate motion, not abrupt, not dramatic, but enough to draw every ounce of attention forward, and the light from the hallway spilled in briefly, casting a brighter edge across the polished floor before. Settling back into the muted tones of the room, the bailiff stepped forward, his voice clear and practiced, carrying the authority of routine. "All rise," he called, and chairs shifted in unison, the soft scrape of wood against tile marking the transition from uncertainty back into structure, or at least the attempt to restore it. People stood, some quickly, some with a fraction of hesitation, their movements reflecting not just respect for the process, but the lingering questions that had not yet been answered. Officer Hayes stood as well, though his posture now carried a stiffness that had not been there before, his grip on the clipboard loosening just slightly as his attention fixed on the front of the room. Amara rose last, not out of defiance, but with a calm deliberateness that set her apart, her movements unhurried, precise, as if she was aligning herself with something deeper than the immediate moment. The bench at the front, which had remained empty until now, no longer felt like an absence, but like a focal point, drawing every gaze toward it as the figure of the judge entered, robes dark against the pale backdrop, steps measured, expression composed in the way that comes from years of maintaining control in rooms filled with tension. The judge took their place behind the bench, setting down a folder with a soft, controlled motion, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to exhale, as if structure had returned, as if order had been restored. "You may be seated," the judge said, voice even, carrying easily across the room, and the sound of chairs settling followed, though the quiet that remained afterward was not the same as before, not entirely. The judge's gaze moved across the room, taking in the arrangement of people, the positioning, the subtle shifts in posture that spoke louder than words, and then it paused, just for a second longer than expected, on Amara. It was not a look of confusion, not quite recognition either, but something in between, like a detail that did not align with expectation. Officer Hayes cleared his throat lightly, stepping forward just enough to regain a sense of control. "Your Honor, we are ready to proceed," he said, his tone measured, though the edges of certainty had begun to soften. The judge nodded once, then glanced down at the documents in front of them, flipping a page with a quiet, deliberate motion, and as they read, the faint crease between their brows deepened, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that something was being reconsidered. Amara remained still, her gaze forward, her presence grounded in a way that did not depend on the room's perception of her, and for a moment, the distance between where she stood and where the judge sat felt smaller than it should have, not physically, but in a way that was harder to define. The clerk shifted slightly, her earlier note now resting at the edge of the document stack, waiting, unspoken but present, and the young attorney watched closely, his attention fixed not just on the judge, but on the unfolding alignment of details that had begun to challenge the initial narrative. The judge looked up again, their gaze moving from the documents to Officer Hayes, then briefly to the clerk, then back to Amara, and something in that sequence suggested that the room was no longer operating on assumption alone. "Before we proceed," the judge said slowly, their voice carrying a new weight, "I would like clarification on the timeline presented in this report." And with that single request, the structure of the moment shifted again, not breaking, but bending, creating space for something that had not been accounted for, something that was now impossible to ignore. The request for clarification did not land as a simple procedural step. It settled into the room with a quiet gravity that pulled every loose thread tighter. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not have an answer, but because the certainty that once came easily now required something more deliberate. Officer Daniel Hayes shifted his weight slightly, the faint creak of his shoes against the polished floor sounding louder than it should have. and he glanced down at the report in his hand as if seeing it for the first time in a different light, his thumb brushing the edge of the paper in a small, controlled motion that betrayed the tension building beneath his composed exterior. Your Honor, the report reflects the information available at the time, he said carefully, choosing each word with precision, as though the phrasing itself might reinforce the authority he felt beginning to slip, but the room did not fully accept it. Not anymore, not without question. The judge's gaze remained steady, not confrontational, not impatient, but expectant, the kind of look that does not demand an answer, but makes it clear that one is required, and that difference shifted the balance further, because expectation invites accountability in ways authority alone cannot. The clerk adjusted the documents in front of her, aligning the pages once more before gently sliding the second file forward, her movement subtle but intentional, placing the discrepancy within the judge's reach without drawing unnecessary attention to herself. Yet the action spoke clearly enough. The judge's eyes dropped to the page, scanning the timestamps with quiet focus, and as the numbers aligned against each other, the faint crease between their brows deepened, not in confusion, but in recognition of something that did not reconcile. Across the room, the young attorney exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight of uncertainty had shifted into something more defined, something that could no longer be dismissed as instinct alone. Amara Bennett stood without moving, her presence steady, her gaze forward, and there was no urgency in her posture. No need to press the moment forward, because it was already unfolding in the only way it could, guided not by force, but by the gradual alignment of truth. Officer Hayes cleared his throat again, this time softer, less assertive, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes flickered toward Amara before returning to the judge, as if searching for something to anchor himself to, some piece of the narrative that remained unchanged. But the more he looked, the more that foundation seemed to shift. Beneath him, there may have been a delay in logging the entry time, he added, his tone still controlled, though the edges had softened, the certainty no longer absolute, and the explanation, while plausible, did not fully close the gap that had been revealed. The judge did not respond immediately. Instead, they turned another page, cross-referencing details with a measured patience that extended the silence just long enough to make it meaningful. And in that silence, the room seemed to lean inward, every subtle movement, every quiet breath contributing to the weight of the moment. Amara lowered her eyes briefly, not in retreat, but in reflection, as if acknowledging the shift without needing to claim it. And when she lifted them again, her expression remained unchanged, calm, grounded, unshaken by the fluctuations around her. The clerk's pen moved once more, adding a second mark beside the first, the ink settling into the paper with a finality that contrasted the uncertainty still present in the room, and the attorney nodded almost imperceptibly, the confirmation silent but shared. Officer Hayes tightened his grip on the clipboard again, though this time it felt less like control and more like resistance, a small effort to hold on to something that was already slipping beyond his reach. The judge finally looked up, their gaze moving deliberately from the documents to Officer Hayes, then briefly to the clerk, and then, once more, to Amara. And in that sequence, something shifted into place, not fully revealed, but unmistakably forming. Accuracy is not optional in this court, the judge said evenly, their voice carrying a quiet authority that did not need to rise to be heard, and the words settled into the room with a clarity that cut through the remaining ambiguity. No one spoke in response, because there was nothing immediate to say, nothing that could restore the simplicity of the narrative that had existed just minutes before, and as the moment stretched, the distance between assumption and truth grew more visible, more undeniable, and somewhere within that space, the next shift waited, patient and certain, ready to surface when the room was finally prepared to see it. For what it was, the judge's words did not echo loudly, but they settled with a finality that shifted the air itself, and for a moment, the room seemed to pause not out of confusion, but out of recognition that something fundamental had changed, something that could not be undone by explanation alone. Officer Daniel Hayes stood still, his posture upright, but no longer anchored in the same certainty, and his eyes moved briefly across the room, not searching for support, but perhaps for alignment. for something that still confirmed the version of events he had relied on. Yet the faces around him no longer reflected that same unquestioned acceptance. The clerk lowered her pen slowly, the faint scratch of ink ending as she placed it neatly beside the documents, her hands now still, as if the act of recording had given way to the act of witnessing. The young attorney shifted in his seat, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, grounding himself in the present moment, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet awareness that the case before him was no longer routine, no longer predictable. Amara Bennett remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, and though she had said very little, her presence now carried a weight that did not depend on volume or repetition. It simply existed, undeniable in its calm. The judge leaned back slightly, their gaze returning to the documents for a final time before closing the folder with a soft, deliberate motion, and that small action signaled something larger. A transition from reviewing what had been presented to questioning what had been assumed. "Officer Hayes," the judge said evenly, their tone unchanged yet more focused now. "This court relies on accuracy not only in documentation, but in conduct. And the distinction, subtle but clear, widened the scope of the moment beyond a simple discrepancy." Hayes inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured, as he nodded once, acknowledging the statement without fully responding to it, because response now required more than formality. It required clarity he was not yet prepared to offer. The judge's gaze shifted again, this time, resting on Amara for a fraction longer, and in that brief pause, something passed between them, not spoken, not obvious, but present, like a recognition that had not yet been fully named. "Ms. Bennett," the judge continued, the use of her name deliberate, precise. "Is there anything you would like to add before we proceed?" And the question, simple in structure, carried a weight that extended beyond the words themselves, because it acknowledged her not as a subject of the process, but as a participant within it. Amara did not answer immediately. She allowed the silence to hold for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, as if she understood that timing was as important as content. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and clear. "Only that the sequence of events matters," she said, her eyes meeting the judge's without challenge, without hesitation, "because it defines what actually happened, not just what was written down." And the clarity of her words did not disrupt the room, it aligned it, bringing focus to what had already begun to surface. The clerk glanced down at her notes, then back up again, her posture subtly shifting as if the foundation beneath her role had steadied, while the attorney nodded once, almost imperceptibly, the connection between detail and meaning now fully formed in his mind. Officer Hayes remained still, his expression controlled, but the tension in his jaw, the slight tightening of his grip, suggested an internal recalibration, a recognition that the narrative he had presented was no longer self-sustaining. It required defense, explanation, and perhaps revision. The judge listened without interruption, their expression composed, but their focus sharpened, as if the pieces of the moment were now aligning into something that demanded a different level of attention. "Sequence," the judge repeated softly, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and with that single word, the structure of the case shifted again, moving away from isolated details and toward a broader understanding of context, of cause and effect, of responsibility. The room did not react outwardly. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements. But the stillness itself had changed. It was no longer passive. It was active, charged with the awareness that what had seemed simple was anything but, and that what had been overlooked was now impossible to ignore. Amara lowered her gaze slightly, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement of the moment as it stood, grounded and complete, while the judge's hand rested lightly on the closed folder, the weight of the decision not yet declared, but clearly forming. And in that quiet, measured pause, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of routine, but a place of reckoning, where the difference between assumption and truth had finally begun to reveal itself, one detail at a time. The word sequence did not fade after it was spoken. It settled into the space between every person in the room, threading through their thoughts, reshaping how each detail was now being understood. And for the first time since the morning began, The courtroom was no longer moving forward out of habit, it was pausing out of necessity. The judge's hand remained still on the closed folder, fingers resting lightly against the surface as if holding the moment in place, not rushing it, not forcing it, allowing the implications to surface naturally. And that patience carried more authority than any raised voice could have. Officer Daniel Hayes shifted again, this time more noticeably, his shoulders tightening as if the uniform he wore had grown heavier, not physically, but in what it now represented, and his eyes moved once more toward Amara Bennett. Though this time the glance did not carry dismissal. It carried something closer to calculation, as if he was trying to understand how the situation had moved beyond his control without him fully realizing when it happened. Amara stood as she had from the beginning, composed, grounded, her presence unchanged by the shifting weight of the room. And yet the way she held herself now seemed different to those who were finally paying attention, not because she had moved, but because they were seeing her clearly for the first time. The young attorney leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers now still against the table, his earlier urgency replaced by a quiet focus, his gaze moving between the judge and the documents, then briefly to Amara, as if connecting the elements of a story that had not been told in full. The clerk adjusted her posture as well, sitting straighter, her hands folded neatly in front of her, no longer simply recording events, but observing them with intention, her earlier marks on the page now representing more than notes. They were anchors of truth in a narrative that had begun to shift. The judge lifted their gaze again, scanning the room not with impatience, but with awareness, taking in the subtle changes that had unfolded. The recalibration of attention, the quiet acknowledgement that something deeper was at play. "Officer Hayes," the judge said, their tone measured but firm, "walk us through the sequence again, step by step." And the request was simple in structure, yet precise in its demand, because repetition under scrutiny does not reinforce a story, it reveals its weaknesses. Hayes inhaled slowly, his breath controlled, and he nodded once, stepping forward slightly as he began to speak. "At approximately 9:15, I observed the defendant entering the building," he said, his voice steady, practiced, but as the words left him, they seemed to carry less certainty than before, as if even he could feel the tension between what was stated and what had already been questioned. And prior to that observation, the judge interjected gently, not interrupting, but guiding, "What documentation supports that timeline?" And the question, quiet and precise, shifted the focus from assertion to evidence. Hayes paused, just briefly, his eyes flickering toward the report in his hand, then back to the judge, and in that pause, the room seemed to lean in again, not physically, but in attention, in expectation. "The report reflects the initial account," he replied, though the phrasing now felt less definitive, more like a placeholder than a conclusion. Amara lowered her gaze for a moment, her fingers adjusting slightly against the cool metal at her wrists, the sensation grounding her, steadying her. And when she looked up again, her eyes moved not to Hayes, but to the judge, her focus clear, unwavering. The judge held that gaze for a fraction longer this time, something unspoken passing in that brief connection, something that suggested alignment not of position, but of understanding. "Initial accounts can be incomplete," the judge said, their voice calm, almost reflective, "which is why sequence matters." And with that, the earlier word returned, not as a repetition, but as a reinforcement, anchoring the moment in its central truth. The attorney nodded once more, his earlier doubt now fully formed into recognition, while the clerk's eyes moved again to the documents, tracing the timeline with renewed clarity, each detail now fitting into a larger context that had been hidden beneath assumption. Officer Hayes stood still, his posture held, but the confidence that once defined it had softened, reshaped by the weight of the unfolding moment, and for the first time, the room did not look to him for answers. It looked beyond him, towards something more grounded, more certain. Amara remained where she was, unchanged in stance, unchanged in tone, yet everything around her had shifted. The room no longer seeing her as part of a routine process, but as a point of reference, a presence that had quietly redirected the course of the moment without force, without demand. And as the silence settled once more, it no longer felt like hesitation. It felt like clarity forming, slow and deliberate, revealing not just what had happened, but what had been overlooked, and in that realization, the courtroom itself seemed to take on a different weight, one where truth was no longer assumed, but carefully, intentionally uncovered. The request to walk through the sequence again did not reset the moment. It exposed it, stretching each second of the timeline into something that could no longer hide behind routine phrasing. And as Officer Daniel Hayes spoke, the rhythm of his words began to slow, not because he forgot them, but because each one now had to pass through a level of scrutiny that had not existed minutes before. At approximately 9:15, he repeated, but this time the number did not land cleanly. It hovered, uncertain, as if even he could hear the gap that had already been identified, and his eyes dropped briefly to the report again, searching for reinforcement that no longer felt automatic. The judge did not interrupt immediately, allowing the silence after that timestamp to stretch just enough to make it visible. And in that space, the room shifted again, not outwardly, but internally, as each person began to reconstruct the sequence in their own mind, aligning what was said with what had been shown. The clerk's fingers moved lightly across the edge of the document, tracing the earlier notation she had made, her focus narrowing as she followed the progression of time from one entry to the next, and the more she looked, the clearer the pattern became, not a dramatic contradiction, but a subtle misalignment that carried significant weight. The young attorney leaned forward again, this time without hesitation, his voice entering the moment with a controlled clarity. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, waiting only a fraction of a second before continuing. "The building security log is automated. It records entry the moment the door is accessed, and that timestamp shows 9:23. And as he spoke, he placed the document on the table with a gentle, deliberate motion, the paper sliding just enough to draw the judge's attention without disrupting the calm of the room. The judge glanced down, their eyes scanning the line again, and this time there was no hesitation in the recognition. The numbers aligned exactly as presented, precise, unambiguous, and in contrast to the earlier report, they carried a different kind of authority, one rooted in system rather than interpretation. Officer Hayes inhaled. Again, his breath deeper now, more measured, as if he was recalibrating in real time, and he nodded once, acknowledging the detail without fully conceding its implication. "There may have been a delay in my observation," he said, adjusting the framing, attempting to bridge the gap between what was recorded and what was stated, but the adjustment itself revealed something more, that the original certainty had shifted into adaptation. Amara Bennett listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and there was no satisfaction in her expression, no visible reaction to the unfolding realization, only a quiet consistency that anchored her in the moment as it evolved around her. The judge's attention moved from the document to Hayes, then briefly to Amara, and then back again, as if mapping the connections between them, not just in words, but in presence, in the way each person occupied the space differently now. "Observation is not the same as occurrence," the judge said calmly, their voice carrying a subtle emphasis that reframed the entire sequence. "And when those two are misaligned, it is the court's responsibility to determine which reflects the truth." And the distinction settled into the room with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. The clerk nodded almost imperceptibly, her earlier hesitation now replaced with quiet confidence, while the attorney leaned back slightly, his role in the moment fulfilled not through argument, but through alignment of fact. Officer Hayes remained still, his posture held, but the energy around him had shifted, no longer centered on authority, but on response, on how he would reconcile the difference that had been laid bare. Amara's eyes moved once more toward the judge, not seeking approval, not requesting validation, but simply present, fully engaged in the process as it unfolded, her earlier words about sequence now fully realized in the structure of the moment. The judge rested their hand lightly against the bench again, the gesture small but grounding, as if anchoring the room in what had now been established. And for a brief second, the silence returned, but it was no longer uncertain. It was defined, shaped by the clarity that had emerged. And in that quiet, the difference between what was written and what had actually occurred stood fully visible, no longer hidden behind assumption, no longer softened by routine, but clear, precise, and impossible to ignore, setting the stage for what would come next, not as a continuation of the same narrative, but as a turning point that could not be reversed. The clarity did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers, each detail reinforcing the last until the room could no longer return to what it had been. And as the distinction between observation and occurrence became fully visible, something deeper began to shift beneath the surface. Something that reached beyond numbers and into responsibility. The judge remained still for a moment, their hand resting lightly on the bench, their gaze lowered toward the documents as if allowing the weight of what had been established to settle before moving forward. And in that pause, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, not in uncertainty, but in anticipation of what would follow. Officer Daniel Hayes stood with a rigidity that no longer signaled confidence, but containment. His shoulders squared, his posture maintained, yet the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, revealed the internal adjustment taking place, the realization that the narrative he had presented was no longer self-sufficient. It required explanation, context, and perhaps correction. The young attorney sat back, his earlier focus now steady, no longer searching, no longer questioning, but observing, his role shifting from uncovering to witnessing the implications unfold. The clerk's hands rested neatly on the desk, her pen set aside, her earlier notes complete, and her attention now fixed on the exchange between the judge and Hayes, her posture reflecting a quiet alignment with the process as it moved forward. Amara Bennett remained composed, her presence unchanged, yet the space around her had transformed, no longer defined by assumption, but by awareness, and though she had not moved, the distance between her and the center of the room felt different now, less like separation and more like connection. The judge lifted their gaze again, this time directing it fully toward Hayes, their expression calm, measured, but undeniably focused. "Officer Hayes," they said, their voice even, "given the discrepancy between your report and the recorded entry time, the court must consider not only the sequence, but the conditions under which your observation was made." And the expansion of scope shifted the moment further, moving beyond what had happened to how it had been interpreted. Hayes inhaled slowly, his breath controlled, and he nodded once, acknowledging the question, though the response that followed carried a different tone, less certain, more deliberate. "It is possible that my initial observation was made under incomplete information," he said, choosing his words carefully, each one placed with intention, yet the phrasing itself revealed the shift, from certainty to possibility, from assertion to acknowledgement. The judge listened without interruption, their gaze steady, allowing the statement to stand on its own, and in that space, the room absorbed the change. The quiet admission that what had been presented as fact was now being reconsidered as interpretation. Amara's eyes moved briefly toward Hayes, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with a calm recognition, as if she had anticipated this moment not as an outcome to be achieved, but as a truth that would eventually surface. The clerk glanced down once more at the documents, her earlier markings now forming a clear path through the sequence, each detail aligned, each timestamp anchored, and the simplicity of the data contrasted sharply with the complexity of how it had been presented. The attorney nodded slightly, his attention returning to the judge, ready for the next shift, the next layer of the process to unfold. The judge leaned forward just slightly, their hands coming together on the bench, fingers interlaced in a gesture that signaled focus. "In this court," they said slowly, their voice carrying a quiet emphasis, "accuracy is not only a matter of record, it is a matter of trust." And the word trust lingered, expanding the implications beyond the immediate case, touching on the broader responsibility carried by those who stood within the system. Hayes remained still, his posture held, but the weight of that word seemed to settle visibly, not as an accusation, but as a recognition of what was at stake. And for a moment, he did not respond, because response now required more than clarification. It required reflection. Amara lowered her gaze briefly, her hands still, her breathing even, and when she looked up again, her focus returned to the judge, her presence grounded in the process, not separate from it, but fully within it. The room remained silent, not out of hesitation, but out of alignment, each person now aware that the moment had moved beyond routine, beyond assumption, into something that required careful consideration, deliberate action, and above all, a commitment to what had been revealed. And in that quiet, the foundation of the case shifted once more, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a steady, undeniable movement toward truth, one that could not be reversed, only followed to its conclusion. The word trust did not fade when it was spoken. It settled into the room like a weight that no one could shift or ignore, and for a moment everything else seemed secondary, the documents, the timestamps, even the sequence itself, because now the question was no longer just what happened, but who had shaped the way it was presented. The judge remained still, their hands lightly clasped on the bench, their gaze steady and unwavering as it rested on Officer Daniel Hayes, not demanding, not accusing, but holding space for something more difficult than a simple answer. Hayes stood with a controlled posture, yet the subtle tension in his shoulders and the measured rise and fall of his breath revealed the internal shift taking place, the realization that the authority he had relied on was now being weighed against something deeper, something that could not be reinforced by repetition or formality alone. The courtroom remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone present understood that whatever came next would define more than just the outcome of a single case. It would define how the process itself was upheld. The young attorney leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed, not eager, not impatient, but fully present, aware that this moment had moved beyond routine advocacy into something that required observation and restraint. The clerk's gaze remained steady as well, her earlier notes now resting as quiet evidence of what had been uncovered, her posture reflecting a calm readiness to continue, but not to interrupt. Amara Bennett stood where she had been from the beginning, her presence grounded, her expression unchanged, and yet there was a quiet shift in how the room related to her, not as someone being processed, but as someone whose presence had reshaped the entire trajectory of the moment. The judge finally spoke again, their voice calm, but carrying a deeper resonance now. Officer Hayes, the court must determine whether the actions taken were based on verified information or on assumption, and the distinction, though simple, expanded the scope once more, moving the focus from error to intent, from discrepancy to accountability. Hayes inhaled slowly, his breath deliberate, and for a moment he did not speak, not out of defiance, but because the answer required more than instinct. It required acknowledgement. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured, though the edges of certainty had softened. The initial assessment was made based on the situation as it was perceived at the time, and the phrasing, careful as it was, carried an implicit shift from definitive statement to contextual explanation. The judge listened without interruption, their expression unchanged, yet their focus sharpened, as if weighing not just the words, but the space between them. Amara's eyes moved briefly toward Hayes, not in challenge, not in judgment, but in quiet recognition, as if she understood that this moment was not about confrontation, but about clarity finally being allowed to surface. The courtroom held its stillness, every movement reduced to the smallest detail, the faint rustle of fabric, the subtle shift of weight, the quiet hum of the lights above, all grounding the moment in a reality that felt both immediate and significant. The judge leaned forward slightly, their hands resting flat against the bench now, the gesture subtle but intentional. "Perception does not replace verification," they said evenly, the words landing with a clarity that left little room for reinterpretation. "And when perception leads action, the consequences must be examined with equal care," and the statement reframed the entire sequence once more, placing responsibility not just on what was recorded, but on how decisions were made in real time. Hayes nodded once, slowly, the movement controlled but meaningful, as if acknowledging a point that could not be easily countered, and for a moment he lowered his gaze, not in defeat, but in reflection, the weight of the moment settling into something more personal, more internal. The attorney remained still, his earlier role now complete, while the clerk's attention stayed fixed on the exchange, her presence steady, grounded in the process as it unfolded. Amara did not move, her posture unchanged, Yet there was a quiet steadiness in her presence that now seemed to anchor the room itself, not through force, not through assertion, but through consistency, through a calm that had never wavered. The judge's gaze shifted once more, moving from Hayes to Amara, and in that brief connection, something unspoken passed, not recognition in the conventional sense, but alignment, a shared understanding of the moment as it had become, and as the silence returned once more, it no longer carried uncertainty or tension, it carried weight, the kind that comes when truth has begun to take shape, when the room itself recognizes that it is no longer moving toward a predetermined outcome, but toward a conclusion that must be earned, one step, one detail, one acknowledgement at a time. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, dense with everything that had been revealed and everything that had yet to be acknowledged. And in that stillness, the courtroom no longer resembled the place it had been at the start of the morning, because the rhythm of assumption had been replaced by something slower, something deliberate, something that required each person present to reconsider not only what they had heard, but how they had chosen to believe it. The judge remained composed, their posture unchanged, yet there was a subtle shift in the way they held the moment now, less as a sequence to be managed and more as a truth to be understood, their gaze steady as it moved once more toward Officer Daniel Hayes, not with pressure, but with expectation that could no longer be avoided. Hayes stood without moving, his uniform still precise, his stance still aligned, but the certainty that once defined him had been replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, and for a brief second, his eyes lowered, not in submission, but in recognition, as if he was finally seeing the full shape of what had unfolded. The young attorney remained still, his earlier role now complete, his attention no longer searching for discrepancies, but observing the shift in accountability, the moment where information turned into responsibility. The clerk sat with her hands folded, her notes resting in front of her, no longer just records of time and sequence, but markers of a turning point that had reshaped the entire narrative. Amara Bennett stood with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, yet now the space around her felt different, no longer defined by distance or misunderstanding, but by a quiet acknowledgement that her words, her restraint, and her clarity had guided the moment without force. The judge spoke again, their voice even, but carrying a depth that reached beyond the immediate exchange. Officer Hayes, the court is not only concerned with what was written, but with how decisions were made in the moment those actions took place. And the statement did not accuse, it clarified. It framed the responsibility in a way that could not be deflected by documentation alone. Hayes inhaled slowly, his breath measured, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone, less guarded, more grounded. Your Honor, the decision was made based on what I believe to be accurate at the time, he said, pausing just long enough to acknowledge the weight of the next words. But I understand now that belief does not replace confirmation, and in that admission, subtle as it was, something shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. The courtroom absorbed the statement in silence, not because it resolved everything, but because it marked a moment of recognition, a point where assumption gave way to accountability. The judge held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of the shift, of the willingness to recognize the gap between perception and fact. Amara's eyes moved briefly toward Hayes, not in judgment, not in victory, but in quiet understanding, as if she recognized that this moment was not about proving someone wrong, but about allowing truth to stand on its own. The clerk glanced down at her notes once more, then closed the file gently, the soft sound of paper settling against paper marking the end of one phase of the moment. While the attorney leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, the tension of discovery now replaced by the steadiness of resolution beginning to take form. The judge rested their hands on the bench again, their presence grounded, their focus clear, and for a moment they did not speak, allowing the silence to hold what had been said, to let it settle fully. Before moving forward, the room remained still, every person present aware that the moment had crossed a threshold, that what came next would not simply continue the process, but redefine it. Amara stood without shifting, her calm unwavering, her presence no longer questioned, and in that quiet steadiness, She had become something more than a participant in the case. She had become the measure by which the moment itself was now being understood, and as the judge finally lifted their gaze once more, preparing to move the court forward, the atmosphere in the room carried a different weight, one that did not rely on authority alone, but on the shared recognition that truth, once revealed, changes everything, not through force, but through the quiet certainty that it cannot be ignored. The moment did not rush forward. It settled deeper, as if the room itself understood that what had just been acknowledged required space to fully exist, and in that stillness, the difference between what had been assumed and what had been revealed became something no one could quietly step away from. The judge remained composed, their posture steady, their presence grounded in a calm authority that did not need to assert itself. And as their gaze moved once more across the room, it carried a quiet finality, not of conclusion, but of direction, as if the next step was no longer uncertain, only necessary. Officer Daniel Hayes stood with a stillness that no longer came from control, but from reflection, his shoulders squared yet softened, his expression no longer guarded in the same way. And for the first time since the morning began, he did not look at the report in his hand. He did not search for reinforcement in the written words. Instead, he stood present in the moment itself, as if recognizing that what mattered now could not be found on paper alone. The young attorney remained silent, his earlier role complete, his attention now resting on the judge, understanding that the outcome of this moment would extend beyond argument, beyond presentation, into something that shaped the integrity of the process itself. The clerk sat with her hands folded, her notes complete, her posture reflecting a quiet awareness that what she had recorded was no longer just part of a case, but part of a turning point, a moment where the system had been asked to look at itself more closely. Amara Bennett stood as she had from the beginning, her presence unchanged, her calm unwavering, and yet everything around her had shifted, not because she demanded it, not because she forced it, but because she remained steady while the truth moved into place around her. The judge finally spoke again, their voice even, but carrying a depth that reached beyond the immediate exchange. This court recognizes that discrepancies in documentation are not merely clerical. They said, their tone measured, deliberate. They reflect the conditions under which decisions are made, and the responsibility that follows those decisions. And the words did not accuse, they clarified. They framed the moment in a way that could not be reduced to error alone. Hayes nodded slowly, the movement deliberate, his gaze lifting to meet the judge's, not with resistance, not with defense, but with acknowledgement. And in that brief connection, something settled, not as resolution, but as acceptance of what had been revealed. Amara's eyes moved briefly toward the judge, then back to the space in front of her, her expression unchanged, yet there was a quiet grounding in her presence, as if the moment had aligned with something she already understood, something she did not need to explain. The judge's attention shifted once more, this time holding on Amara for a fraction longer. And in that pause, something unspoken passed, something that moved beyond the structure of the case, beyond the roles assigned within the room. Ms. Bennett, the judge said, their voice calm, steady. Your emphasis on sequence has provided clarity to this court. And the acknowledgement, simple as it was, carried weight, not because it elevated her, but because it recognized the role she had played in revealing what had been overlooked. The courtroom remained silent, not out of tension, but out of alignment. Each person present aware that the moment had moved beyond its original frame, that it had become something more, something that required not just continuation, but reflection. Officer Hayes lowered his gaze briefly, then straightened again, his posture no longer rigid, but grounded, as if he had stepped out of the certainty he once held and into something more deliberate, more aware. The clerk exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, while the attorney shifted slightly in his seat, the quiet movements of the room reflecting a shared understanding that the process had changed, even if the structure remained the same. Amara stood without moving, her presence steady, her calm intact, and in that stillness, she did not appear as someone who had challenged the system, but as someone who had reminded it of its own foundation. The judge rested their hands lightly against the bench once more, their gaze moving across the room in a final, measured sweep, and in that moment, The courtroom no longer felt like a place of routine judgment, but a place where truth had been allowed to surface, not through force, not through conflict, but through quiet persistence and clarity. And as the silence settled one last time, it carried with it a sense of completion, not because everything had been resolved, but because something essential had been restored, a balance between perception and verification, between authority and accountability, between what is written and what is real. The silence at the end did not feel like an ending. It felt like a return, a quiet realignment of something that had drifted too far from its purpose and had finally found its way back. And as the judge remained seated behind the bench, hands resting lightly against the surface, there was no need for a dramatic conclusion, no need for raised voices or final declarations, because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed into the room, steady and undeniable. The fluorescent lights continued their low hum, casting the same pale glow across the polished wood and neatly stacked files. But the room beneath them no longer felt the same. It carried a different weight now, one shaped not by authority alone, but by awareness, by the quiet recognition that every action, every word, every assumption held consequences that could not be overlooked. Officer Daniel Hayes stood still for a moment longer before finally lowering the clipboard in his hand, the movement small but meaningful, as if setting aside not just the document, but the version of certainty he had carried with it. And when he looked up again, his gaze did not avoid the bench. It met it, steady, grounded, not in defense, but in acknowledgement, a silent acceptance that what had happened could not be undone, only understood. The young attorney gathered his papers slowly, not rushing, not eager to leave, but moving with the quiet awareness that he had witnessed something beyond a standard proceeding, something that would remain with him long after the case itself was closed. The clerk closed her file with a soft, deliberate motion, her pen resting neatly on top, her notes complete, and for a brief moment she paused, her eyes lifting toward Amara Bennett, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, as if acknowledging the quiet role she had played in guiding the moment toward clarity. Amara stood without moving, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and as the room began to settle into its new understanding, there was no shift in her presence, no sign of triumph, no need for acknowledgement, because she had never stood there to prove anything, only to remain steady while the truth found its place. The judge's gaze moved across the room one final time, not searching, not questioning, but observing, taking in the stillness that now held a different meaning. And when they spoke, their voice carried a quiet certainty that did not seek attention. This court stands on the principle that clarity is not granted, it is maintained. They said, the words simple, measured, yet grounded in everything that had unfolded. And as they settled into the space, they did not instruct, they reminded. Hayes nodded once, slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly, the rigid line of his posture softening into something more human, more aware, and though he said nothing, the acknowledgement was there, carried not in words, but in the way he remained present, no longer insulated by assumption. Amara lowered her gaze for a brief moment, her breath steady, and when she looked up again, it was not toward the judge, not toward Hayes, but forward, as if the moment had already completed itself, as if there was nothing more to hold on to, nothing more to resolve. The courtroom began to move again, chairs shifting, papers being gathered, the quiet sounds of routine returning, yet they carried a different tone now, less mechanical, more deliberate, as if each movement had gained a small awareness of its place within the larger structure. The bailiff stepped back toward his position, the door at the side of the room opening just enough to allow the next case to prepare, the rhythm of the court continuing, steady and uninterrupted, yet subtly changed. And as Amara finally took a step forward, the faint sound of her movement against the polished floor marking the first clear motion she had made in what felt like a long, suspended moment. There was no spotlight, no announcement, no shift in status that needed to be declared, because the change had already happened where it mattered, in the way the room had seen her, in the way it had listened, in the way it had corrected itself without being forced. She walked with the same calm she had carried from the beginning, past the rows of benches, past the clerk's desk, past the space where assumption had once stood unchallenged, and as she reached the doorway, The light from the hallway touched the edge of her shoulder, soft, steady, and without pause, she stepped through it, leaving behind not a victory, not a defeat, but a moment where the system had remembered what it was meant to be. And in the quiet that followed, as the next voices prepared to fill the space, the echo of what had just happened remained, not loud, not demanding, but present, like a steady breath beneath the surface, reminding anyone who chose to listen that respect is not given by position. It is proven through how one chooses to see another, even in the smallest, quietest moments.